Hey microbiology students! This is our last video in lecture 17 on eukaryotic pathogens. In this lecture video, we are going to be discussing parasitic helminth worms. So parasitic helminths or worms, they are multicellular eukaryotes. They are actually tiny animals. Because they're animals, they have animal body systems, including digestive systems, circulatory, nervous, excretory, as well as reproductive systems. Sometimes we have a separate male and a separate female who reproduce sexually. Other times we have what are called hermaphrodites. So that means the worm has both male and female reproductive organs in one animal, and therefore it can self-fertilize. So methods of transmission for parasitic worms really fall into three different categories. Category 1, you ingest something contaminated with the eggs or the larval stage. We call this route of transmission fecal to oral. Recall that is a method of indirect transmission. Category 2, you're bitten by an insect, a biological vector organism that carries the larval stage and introduces that into your blood. Category 3, larvae burrow directly into the skin from water or mud. So the way I'm going to organize my lecture today, I'm going to organize the pathogens that we're going to discuss by their mode of transmission. So we'll take each category and talk about example organisms that fall into that category with some of the general characteristics that are similar among those organisms, as well as some characteristic differences. Before we do that, let's take a quick overview of the general life cycle of helminth worms. So helminth worms reproduce sexually. Therefore, they lay fertilized eggs that are laid by the female or by the hermaphroditic worm. Those eggs are usually passed from the infected individual. Those eggs then mature into a larval stage. And then those larval stage, it's like a juvenile stage. And then these juvenile worms then grow into the adult worms. So a couple other terms I'd like to add to this slide. So eggs are usually the most resistant of the three stages in the helminth life cycle. So the eggs are passed out of the body of some sort of host animal and are going to be present in the environment. So this could mean in water or in soil, or on fomites, objects, surfaces. Okay, also potentially food items as well. Okay, the larval stage, this juvenile worm stage, is usually present in some sort of host animal. It's possible for the larval stage and the adult stage to also be in the same animal, although not always the case. So in some of the instances we're going to discuss today, the host animal that hosts the larval stage of the helminth worm is referred to as the intermediate host. In other words, the parasite only spends a temporary time inside of that particular animal body, and not the adult form, so just the larval form. So the adult form, the host animal that hosts the adult form, we call that host the definitive host. Definitive host means this is the host that harbors the adult worms that are sexually mature and are reproducing. So like I said, sometimes the larval and the adult can both be in the definitive host, but other times the larval stage is only in the intermediate host. Okay, so we're going to start by grouping our pathogenic helminth worms by their modes of transmission, starting with the method of fecal to oral. So for those pathogens with this method of transmission, I have made this little red box here where, just to emphasize, the transmission is fecal to oral, and then this symbol is hand washing, which is that this method of transmission could be prevented by proper hygiene and hand washing. So this worm is alarmingly huge and macroscopic, meaning that you don't need a microscope to see this worm. This is Ascaris lumbricoides. This is a roundworm. It's huge. They can get to be about 18 inches in length. They're separate males and females with complete body systems. They reside in the intestines, where they then shed eggs that get passed through feces. Those eggs end up in the environment or on fomites or in food and water. And then the next unfortunate person will ingest those eggs. And then those eggs will mature into this larval stage and the adult stage in the intestines. So lucky for you, you live in the United States. In the United States, we have invested lots and lots of taxpayer money to clean our water supplies. You can drink the tap water here in San Diego, and you don't have to worry that it has helminth eggs in it, or really any pathogen in it. That's because we treat our water, we chlorinate our water, we purify our water. A lot of people even choose to further purify their tap water here in the United States. If you live in other parts of the world, a lot of times the sewage contaminates the drinking supplies, and people become sick with these types of parasites. This particular parasite, Ascaris, is approximated by the World Health Organization to infect roughly 1.2 billion people in the world currently. People who have an intestinal roundworm infection usually are aware of it. So a lot of times they have excessive weight loss caused by nutrient deficiencies as a result of this worm, of course, eating all of your food. And then they have significant intestinal discomfort as the worm continues to reproduce and grow in the intestinal tract. Sometimes these worms can pass out of the feces 18 inches. Unbelievable. These worms have been noted to travel to other parts of the body besides the intestines, and there are records documenting the passing of Ascaris worms from the nose, from the mouth, from the skin, and from the rectum. Here we see what the egg stage looks like. So the egg stages are microscopic, okay? Occasionally the adults' worms are macroscopic, which means you can see them without a microscope, but the egg and usually the larval stages are microscopic, for helminth worms. Okay, our next pathogen, Enterobius vermicularis. This worm, that's the scientific name, by the way. There's a common name for Enterobius, and it's pinworm. Transmission fecal to oral. Washing your hands would prevent the spread of pinworms. So here we can see the microscopic egg stage shown here. And we're also seeing the adult stage. So these worms can be about a ½ inch in length. So this is also macroscopic. It is possible to pass the adult stage, although usually infected individuals will pass only the egg stage in their feces. Let's take a look at the life cycle of the pinworm from the CDC's chart here. So this is the pinworm called Enterobius vermicularis. You should be able to recognize scientific names as well as a common name here like pinworm. Where do we begin? Oh, here we go. Number 1, so the eggs. Eggs pass from the feces. And fecal to oral, so a healthy person ingests those eggs. Those eggs might be contaminating an object or bedding or clothing, or so that would all be fomite transmission, or it could be from not washing your hands and preparing food. That could also transmit. Pinworms are really common in daycare settings and in very small children preschool age. Pinworm infections can travel through these classrooms, especially daycares, because one of the symptoms that these children experience if they have a pinworm infection, notice what's happening. So the eggs travel to the intestines where the larval stage hatches, small intestine. Now we have the adults. There's a separate female and a separate male. They mature in the large intestine. And what happens is the female, she will lay her eggs in the perianal region. So right in the rectum area. She'll lay her eggs usually at night, okay, or early in the morning, like 3, 4 a.m. She'll lay her eggs, and so the child will, of course, itch the rectal area, and a lot of times those eggs will get underneath the child's fingernails. And then that child may not be washing their hands, because that's definitely something we work on with our preschool age children. Well, all people really, but especially trying to form positive hand washing habits early in life is important. So we want our children to be washing their hands before they eat, especially, but multiple times a day, after they use the restroom, absolutely. And what happens is if they don't do that, what do children do in daycare? Well, they put all the toys in their mouth, okay? They're going to put all the toys in their mouth. So one kid with pinworms has been itching their bottom. They have pinworm eggs on their hands that are microscopic. Okay, then they touch some toy. They transfer the pinworm eggs onto that toy. Fomite, right? Fomite transmission. Then healthy kid comes along and mouths that toy, puts the toy in his or her mouth, and now has ingested the eggs. So that is one way that this can spread through young childhood or young children populations, unless hand washing is implemented. These eggs are known to survive on surfaces for 2 to 3 weeks. So if a pinworm infection does occur, it's important to use bleach. Bleach is a good way to get rid of these pinworm eggs. And a lot of times daycare settings, they tell you that they do that, or children's museums, where you see the workers coming along and disinfecting the toys and the objects and everything that the kids touch or play with, because it's well known that young children are not as good at washing their hands And if they have an infectious disease like pinworms, they can easily transmit those eggs onto objects, and other kids will easily pick them up. And all you have to do is put your hands in your mouth or put that object in your mouth. Okay, so this one is also transmission fecal to oral. However, this particular pathogen, this is Trichinella spiralis, the cause of trichinosis. Notice it's fecal to oral transmission, but I have a picture here of a meat thermometer stuck in there because the way to prevent this transmission of fecal to oral, hand washing isn't going to help here, actually. What's going to help is to thoroughly cook your meat to the correct temperature. So Trichinella spiralis will circulate through certain populations of animals, where pigs in particular, although it has been found in some cattle, also in wild game. So people who hunt, maybe hunt deer or bear or elk, it's possible that those animals are infected with Trichinella spiralis. And this particular worm embeds itself into the muscle of the animal. Here we can see that on the slide, it gets its name because it has this spiral shape. Let's outline it so we can see it a little bit better. And here our striated muscle sample here. So this is the worm. It burrows in to the muscle. And so it does that in the animals. So you eat the infected meat, and the larva, if it's undercooked, okay, so the problem is if it's undercooked. So if you're thoroughly cooking your meat to the right temperature, then you don't have to worry. But a lot of people like their meat rare. They want to see the blood juicing out of it. Okay, but you put yourself at risk for infectious disease if you do that. Just FYI. So you eat this pulled pork sandwich, and it's got some undercooked, it's a little bit rare. There's a Trichinella spiralis larvae bedded in the muscle of the animal that you're eating. What happens? Well, the larvae, they come out of the meat in your intestines and they burrow into your, eventually into your muscle. This causes a disease called trichinosis. Usually what happens is when you have all these worms embedded in your muscle, usually muscle aches are one of the first signs or symptoms of that infection. Following that, you might have a rash, as well as you have like a localized inflammatory response to the area where it's embedded. The human is considered the dead end host. What does that mean, to be a dead end host? Well, this means that it's not transmissible to anything. Pathogen doesn't transmit. So this pathogen will just burrow into the muscle and just stay there, causing muscle aches, some pain, some almost arthritis-like symptoms in some cases. So usually when I teach this unit on the parasitic worms, I show you some videos from one of my favorite shows. It is from Animal Planet. Some of you might have seen it. It's called Monsters Inside Me. And so I have found several episodes, short episodes, okay, like under 10 minutes, okay, where a specific disease that we're discussing in the unit is described with a really nice case study. So you sort of put a face to the story of these infectious disease agents. So rather than showing you those during this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to post them on Canvas. So do take a look at those. I think that really helps you to understand the medical significance and certainly the patient's experience, the human host experience of having some of these infectious diseases. So there is one Monsters Inside Me video of a young dancer woman. She's really young and she contracts this disease from eating pulled pork sandwiches at a company picnic, she says. And she gets a crazy bad rash and then eventually this aching muscles, and she ends up getting diagnosed with trichinosis. How do you think people get diagnosed correctly with parasitic worms? Because the symptoms of sort of muscle aches and a rash, a localized rash, boy, that could be anything, don't you think? That could be, well, we've talked a lot about, diseases of the skin, and sort of achiness is a really non-specific symptom that makes it hard for the medical professionals to narrow it down. So one of the things they do in the story of this woman, the dancer woman, is they take a blood sample. They take a blood count. What white blood cell would be elevated in somebody who has a parasitic worm infection? You think back to your lecture on the leukocytes, the white blood cells. That's right, it would be the eosinophils. So elevated eosinophils in a blood test. That would be a clue that we're dealing with a parasitic worm infection and not a viral infection or not a bacterial infection. Good. They can also do things like take muscle biopsies. And this is where this picture comes from, a muscle biopsy. Okay, transmission fecal to oral continues. This one is preventable by hand washing. Yay! Tapeworms. Wow. Okay, tapeworms. Here's one particular species, Taenia solium. Extremely long intestinal parasites. Boy, these can get to be about 25 feet. These can be very, very long. And they can survive for about 20 years inside of the body. Fecal to oral, so we're going to be passing these eggs, the eggs to be passed in feces and then transmitted to a healthy host by fomites or from contaminated food or water. So Taenia cilium, these tapeworms, they have these flat segmented bodies, as you can see. They are hermaphrodites, so look in these segments. Do you see that there's both testes and ovaries in the same spot? And that's so that they can self-fertilize. And by the way, these segments, we have a specific name for that. Let's see, I've got it in here. We call it proglottids. So proglottids refer to this segment, these body segments, and you see it's composed of many of these proglottids. So the mature proglottids are at the end of the worm, and they're mature because they're full of eggs that have been fertilized, self-fertilized. And this is actually these little packets of proglottids, they break off in the feces and get passed as little packets of eggs. The other structure we see on this slide is the scolex. The scolex refers to the head. So here would be the head or the scolex. So notice the little hooks and suckers. It uses those structures to stick to the intestinal wall and hang out there and just grow its tail longer and longer and longer, and self-fertilize and produce these little mature proglottids full of eggs. So this infection is also associated with weight loss. Believe it or not, there are these online companies that sell tapeworm eggs. They come in a little vial in the mail. They send them to people. They tell them to eat the eggs of the tapeworm, and then the tapeworms hatch and the intestines grow into a mature tapeworms, stick to your intestines and absorb your nutrients, and it's advertised as weight loss, as a weight loss strategy. And then for another fee, they'll send you the medication you need to be treated by worms. So that sounds awful. Definitely not recommended, because excessive tapeworm infections, of course, long-term tapeworm infections leads to severe vitamin deficiency. Okay. Let's move on to the second type of transmission. I only have one example in this category, although there are more than one. The one example I want to talk about is the Onchocerca volvulus worm. Transmission biological vector. It's actually black fly bite, but not your house flies that are around your house today. No, it's endemic. The particular vector is endemic to parts of Africa and South America. So it's known to be a tropical disease. What happens is so these black flies, they breed in moist environments, and then they become infected uh, by drinking the water of lakes and streams that harbor the worm larval stage. And then the black flies will bite, and they'll transmit the larva into your subcutaneous tissue. So initially what happens is sort of these raised bumps, like a rash on the skin where the black fly bite was. It's possible to take a skin biopsy and see all of these little worms moving around under the microscope just from a skin biopsy. Eventually, they will migrate to the blood. This is a bit of a lengthy process, so it's not an immediate, you get blind, immediately. It's recognized that permanent blindness is more of it's a chronic infection that progresses for the earliest they've seen the blindness occurs about 6 months after infection. So, it's a lengthy process. So the worm larvae go into the subcutaneous tissue. At that point, you could detect them by skin biopsy, and then they move into the blood, and then eventually into the cornea of the eye. And in this picture, we're seeing somebody who has these worms in their eye, and that, of course, causes inflammation and permanent scarring in the eye, and that's because those cells in the cornea don't replace by mitosis. So if you get permanent damage in parts of your eye, there's no healing that happens. I've got on my slide here, it's second leading cause of blindness worldwide. That's pretty amazing. And I do have a Monster Inside Me clip for this one as well, of a scientific researcher who goes to Africa to do his research, and he ends up contracting river blindness. And they do the skin biopsy. So if you want to see the skin biopsy, pretty interesting. Okay, now we're at our last category. And the last category of transmission is that the larvae penetrate the skin. So here I've got a foot. It doesn't have to be a foot, it can be anywhere. But usually what's happening with Necator is that people are walking barefoot in the streets. This is again third world, more of a third world country problem, but in Central and South America, that's where it gets its name, Americanus. So the larvae are in the soil. They penetrate the skin when you walk around barefoot in the mud, and then it causes cutaneous larval migrans. Take a look at these pictures where you can see these inflamed blood vessels. It's very clear that this person has these little larval worms in there. The worms are microscopic, but you can definitely see the inflamed blood vessels. At that point, it gets a little complicated. So the larvae will then enter the blood, and then they'll go to the lungs where they get coughed up, swallowed, and then fully mature into the small intestine as sort of their target organ. And then they pass, the infected human would pass eggs in the feces. And this is what the egg stage would look like here on the right. So let's review that one more time. This is going to be with pictures. So we'll start at the top. All right, so the larvae penetrate the skin from walking around barefoot in mud, contaminated with larvae, contaminated with feces, basically. People who have this infection and they're passing the feces, and the feces have eggs, and those eggs mature into larvae. So larvae are ready to move, and they're ready to get into the skin. They have these little mouth parts, penetrate, bite into the skin. They're microscopic, so you don't exactly see all this happening, but not without a microscope. Okay, so the larvae enter the lung capillaries. At that point, they get into the alveolar spaces. This causes people to cough. They cough up the larvae, or the larvae can even migrate up the trachea. They're swallowed because the adults mature in the small intestine, and then the egg packets pass through the feces, and then the larvae mature in the environment, and then transmit to a healthy person who walks along. Lovely. This one is known to be one of the most common human worm parasites in North America. All right, so this is our last pathogen in the Helminth worm category. The disease is called Schistosomiasis, and this is caused by the Schistosoma hematobium worm, although there's a couple other species as well within the Schistosoma genus. Transmission, it's still in our larval penetrate the skin category. All you have to do is put your feet in the water, and these larvae will penetrate skin. So let's start with the infection cycle. We'll look at it in bullet point form first, and then we'll look at it in diagram form on the next slide. All right, so it starts with an infected human. This human is going to use the freshwater lake or stream like a toilet, and they're going to release thousands of eggs by urinating or defecating in the freshwater stream that other people are going to wade or swim or bathe in. Fabulous. So those eggs get released into the fresh water, and they mature into larvae. Those larvae then enter the intermediate host, a freshwater snail. The freshwater snail does not harbor the adult, so that's why we call it the intermediate host, okay? It breeds inside of the snail, or basically replicates inside of the snail, and then eventually kills the snail, releasing another form of the larva. So now this snail larva gets released. It only survives in the fresh water for about 48 hours before it must enter a new host via the skin. So the human is what we call the definitive host. Remember, that word refers to the host where the adults mature and reproduce. So this is also a lengthy process where it could take a while for the larvae to make their way to the bladder and the intestines, but those two locations are where the mature adults like to live and attach. So the male and the female are separate species, and they form a reproductive pair, and they mate for life inside the human. Isn't that sweet? Up to 5 to 8 year lifespan. Then the infected human passes the eggs in their feces, in their urine, and it enters another human via the skin. Okay, we'll look at that one more time, this time in picture form. Let's start down here. We'll start down here where it's talking about the urine or the feces are have the egg stage. So this is what the egg stage looks like, microscopic. Okay, so the eggs will hatch into this form of the larva. Okay, it's called the Miracidia larva. And the Miracidia larva must invade a freshwater snail. That is a requirement. It must invade a freshwater snail. So it doesn't directly pass human to human. You notice that? So it needs this intermediate host. Okay, so then a new form of larva. This one has an interesting little tail structure. And this larva is the type of larva that penetrates the human skin. And then eventually that larva migrates to the bladder or to the intestines. And here's what the adults look like. And what happens is the male and the female, when they form a reproductive pairing, they actually fit together. And that is so that they can continuously mate and keep producing lots of eggs. There is a complication associated with long-term schistosomiasis. And the complication is bladder cancer. You should watch the story of the woman who goes to Africa on vacation. She swims in Lake Malawi, which is well known to be contaminated with the parasite that causes schistosomiasis. She comes back, and months later, months after her trip, she's having a rash caused by the urine, so rash in the groin area. And that rash is caused by the eggs that are being passed from her urine, and then getting embedded in her skin and causing a local rash. And then they eventually find out it's schistosomiasis and they treat her with the medication. So there are anti-parasitic medications that are available. Those parasitic medications usually have two strategies. One, the medication either prevents the eggs from hatching, or two, it prevents some sort of metabolic pathway inside of the adult, so the adults don't survive. Okay, so that's parasitic worms. And I've been getting text messages that it's time for dinner. Oh, so hungry. No, after this lecture. Usually I give this lecture and then I say, okay, lunch break. And it's lunch break time in the class, and everybody sort of looks around queasy, and yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Not hungry. I'm good. Amazingly though, schistosomiasis, would you get this from eating contaminated water? Drinking contaminated water? No, it really needs to penetrate the skin. So it's wading in the water, it's swimming in the water is the method of transmission. Anyways, I hope that was helpful. And this also correlates with the Lab 31 that you'll be doing this week. And you'll look at some of the egg stage and the adult stage for these parasitic worms. Have fun, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye, guys.